The crystal chandeliers of the Sterling building cast a golden, victorious glow over Genevieve's perfect night. It was the launch of her own law firm, a milestone built on a decade of relentless ambition. Amidst the clinking of champagne flutes and the flash of cameras, she slid a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the marble bar toward her husband, Julian. Her smile remained flawless for the guests, but her eyes held a cold, absolute finality. She expected anger, perhaps a quiet pleading. Instead, Julian simply looked at the sharp edge of the envelope, recognizing the unmistakable weight of a betrayal long overdue. If you find yourself captivated by the quiet storms hidden behind closed doors and the silent costs of betrayal, subscribe and stay with us as we unfold this cinematic journey. The penthouse level of the Sterling building buzzed with the intoxicating hum of new money and raw power. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering Manhattan skyline, a perfect, sprawling backdrop for the birth of Bennett and Hayes. Waiters in crisp black vests drifted through the sea of designer suits and silk dresses, balancing silver trays of Dom Perignon. Standing near the edge of the room, Julian St. James nursed a single glass of bourbon. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his posture relaxed, though his dark eyes tracked the room with the precision of a hawk. He was watching his wife. Genevieve was radiant. She wore an emerald green gown that caught the ambient light, her laughter ringing out clear and melodic as she worked the room. She was the woman of the hour, the brilliant legal mind who had finally broken away to build her own empire. For 8 years, Julian had been the quiet force stabilizing her life, managing the home, softening her sharp edges, and sacrificing his own architectural ambitions so she could clock 80-hour weeks without a backward glance. Tonight, however, the distance between them felt like a physical chasm. Julian watched as Genevieve gracefully excused herself from a group of potential investors. She caught his eye across the room. The warmth that usually accompanied her public smiles vanished the moment she broke eye contact with the crowd. She moved toward him with purposeful, predatory steps. As she approached the quiet alcove where he stood, she didn't offer a hug or a kiss for the cameras. Instead, she rested her clutch on the polished marble bar. From beneath it, she withdrew a thick, stiff manila envelope. "Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a low, businesslike murmur that barely carried over the jazz band playing in the corner. "We need to handle this tonight." She slid the envelope across the cool marble. It stopped exactly an inch from his fingers. Julian didn't look at the envelope right away. He looked at her. He studied the tightness around her mouth, the cold, calculating glint in her hazel eyes. Then, his gaze drifted past her shoulder. Standing by the ice sculpture, nursing a martini, was Alexander Ashford, Genevieve's new named partner. Alexander was watching them with feigned nonchalance, but his jaw was tight, his posture rigid with anticipation. Julian looked back down at the envelope. The heavy paper felt rough against his fingertips as he slowly lifted the unsealed flap. Inside, the crisp white pages bore the unmistakable, sterile formatting of legal doom. Petition for dissolution of marriage. He didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He just ran his thumb over the sharp edge of the paper, his eyes catching a specific, glaring detail on the second page, a financial clause that told him everything he needed to know about who had actually drafted this document. The jazz band swung into a lively tempo, a cruel juxtaposition to the absolute stillness settling over Julian. He let the flap of the manila envelope fall closed. The heavy paper landed against the marble bar with a soft, dismissive thud. He didn't pull the documents out. He didn't need to read the fine print to understand the architecture of his wife's betrayal. Genevieve shifted her weight, the emerald silk of her gown whispering against her legs. "It is standard, Julian," she said, her voice dropping an octave, slipping into the practiced, neutralizing tone she used with difficult opposing counsel. "Generous, even, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Julian repeated, the words tasting like ash. His voice was entirely devoid of the hysteria she had clearly braced herself for. He took a slow, measured sip of his bourbon, letting the amber liquid burn a path down his throat. Over the rim of his crystal glass, his eyes drifted past her again. Alexander Ashford had closed the distance by a few feet, positioning himself near a marble pillar. The man was a shark in a custom-tailored suit, radiating the kind of arrogant magnetism that Julian knew appealed to Genevieve's relentless ambition. But it was not just professional admiration Julian saw now. It was the micro-expressions. The way Alexander's eyes lingered not on Genevieve's face, but on the exposed curve of her neck. The subtle, almost imperceptible nod Alexander gave her, a silent command, a shared secret language born in crumpled hotel sheets and whispered boardroom promises. Julian felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over him. If he threw the glass, if he tore the papers and shouted his fury to the room of elites, he would become the bitter, erratic soon-to-be ex-husband. He would give Genevieve the exact narrative she needed to justify her sudden cruelty to her peers. If he chose the explosive path, he would lose his dignity, and she would win the crowd's sympathy. Instead, he chose the silence. He chose to let them drown in their own hubris. "You chose an interesting venue for this, Jen," Julian finally murmured, setting his glass down. The ice clinked against the crystal, a sharp, singular note of finality in the noisy room. Genevieve's jaw tightened. The lack of a scene was clearly unnerving her. She had prepared for anger, for grief, for a desperate negotiation. She had no defense against profound apathy. It had to be done. "We are starting a new chapter tonight. It is better to cut the cord clean while the momentum is forward. For both of us." "A new chapter," Julian echoed, his gaze flicking deliberately to Alexander. The other man hastily looked away, suddenly intensely interested in the olive in his martini. "Or just a merger you did not want to disclose during the planning phase?" Genevieve flinched. It was a microscopic fracture in her flawless porcelain mask, but Julian caught it. The air between them thickened, suffocating and heavy, as the weight of what he was implying hung suspended over the thick envelope. Genevieve's flinch was the exact physical reaction she had tried to hide 6 months ago. The subtle tightening of her jaw pulled Julian's mind backward, away from the glittering chandeliers of the Sterling building, returning to a rain-lashed Tuesday evening in November. He had been in his home studio, painstakingly drafting blueprints for a suburban library, when his wide-format printer jammed. Genevieve was in the master bathroom, the shower running in a steady, drumming rhythm. He had stepped into her home office to use the backup printer, the room smelling faintly of her signature sandalwood perfume. Her personal laptop was left open, the screen glowing softly in the otherwise dark room. He had not been snooping. He merely tapped the trackpad to wake the machine and route his document. But the private email client was open, bypassing the firm's secure corporate server. A new message materialized at the very top of the screen. The sender was simply listed as A.A. The preview text was brief, devoid of romantic flourish, but devastating in its cold implication. "The suite at the Archer is booked for Thursday. Tell him you have a late deposition." Were the Emerald. Julian vividly remembered the physical sensation of the oxygen vanishing from the room. He remembered the sound of the water running down the hall, washing away the remnants of a life he thought they shared, while he stood paralyzed in the pale, blue light of the monitor. In that solitary, suffocating moment, he faced a brutal dilemma: tear open the bathroom door and shatter their world with raw, screaming agony, or close the laptop and begin silently fortifying his own survival. If he chose the explosive confrontation, he would be reduced to an emotional wreck, scrambling for pieces of a broken marriage while giving her the upper hand in the inevitable fallout. If he stayed quiet, he would have to swallow the daily poison of her lies. He chose the poison. He had closed the laptop, walked back to his blueprints, and began to observe the intricate architecture of her deception. Now, standing in the heart of her ultimate triumph, Julian looked down at the breathtaking emerald gown draping elegantly over her frame. Were the emerald. The cruel poetry of the garment was a private joke between her and Alexander, a joke they did not realize he was privy to. Genevieve shifted uncomfortably under his unwavering, hollow gaze. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail against the thick manila envelope, desperate to drag him back to her carefully orchestrated timeline. I have a notary waiting in the private lounge down the hall, she pressed, her voice growing tight, finally losing its practiced, courtroom smoothness. Just sign it, Julian. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Before Julian could answer Genevieve's tense demand, a slender hand, adorned with delicate silver rings, settled gently on his forearm. He didn't flinch, nor did he break his stony gaze from his wife. Julian. A voice cut through the heavy silence between them. It was Megan. She had been the maid of honor at their wedding, the vibrant, chaotic counterpoint to Genevieve's calculating precision. Tonight, however, Megan's usual effervescence was muted, replaced by a nervous, searching look. Genevieve's expression instantly tightened into a strained, polite smile, the mask slipping back into place with alarming speed. "Megan, dear," she practically purred, the sugary tone clashing violently with the cold, hard manila envelope resting on the marble between them. "Are you enjoying the champagne? It's the vintage you like." "Yes, it's lovely," Megan replied smoothly, though her eyes flicked rapidly between Julian's rigid posture and the sharp edge of the envelope. The unspoken tension radiated off them in invisible, suffocating waves. "I just wanted to steal Julian for a moment. To catch up." Genevieve's smile wavered, a brief flash of annoyance crossing her face before she nodded tightly. "Of course. Do not keep him long. We have business to conclude." She shot Julian a final, commanding look before turning on her heel, the emerald gown swishing against the floor as she moved toward a group of senior partners. Megan watched Genevieve retreat, her hand tightening slightly on Julian's arm. She leaned in closer, the scent of lavender and gin masking the overwhelming sweetness of the party's floral arrangements. "Julian," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is going on? She has been acting strangely all night. And the way she looks at Alexander." Julian closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the overwhelming urge to confess, to break his silence and let someone else share the crushing weight of his reality, warring with his desperate need for control. Megan was a true friend, someone who had known them both for years. If he told her the truth, if he showed her the envelope and the cold, calculated betrayal hidden inside, he would gain an ally, someone to stand beside him in the wreckage. But if he confided in her, he would shatter his strategic silence. He would hand over a piece of the narrative, a variable he could no longer control. The gossip would spread, the sympathy would flow, and Genevieve would have the opportunity to spin the story, to paint him as the bitter, jealous ex-husband lashing out. He opened his eyes, meeting Megan's worried gaze. He forced a small, tired smile onto his face, carefully burying the agony beneath a layer of practiced weariness. "It's just the stress of the launch, Meg," Julian said softly, the lie tasting metallic on his tongue. He gently disengaged his arm from her grasp. "You know how she gets when the spotlight is on her. She just needs this night to be perfect." Megan hesitated, clearly unconvinced, her eyes searching his face for a crack in his armor. "If you say so. But, if you need anything, Julian, you know I'm here." He nodded slowly, watching her retreat back into the glittering crowd. He had chosen the isolation, the cold, lonely path of control. Now, all that was left was to walk it to the end. The brief reprieve offered by Megan's departure evaporated as Genevieve materialized at Julian's side once more. The polite, social grace she had worn for the crowd was entirely gone, replaced by a brittle, frantic energy. Without a word, she gripped his elbow, her manicured nails biting sharply through the wool of his suit, and steered him away from the bustling bar. She guided him into a dimly lit alcove near the coat check, a narrow corridor shielded from the main ballroom by heavy velvet curtains. The lively jazz music became a muffled, distant pulse. Here, stripped of her audience, the true extent of her anxiety bled through her confident facade. Genevieve thrust the manila envelope against his chest. Julian caught it smoothly, his expression remaining perfectly blank. "I saw Megan sniffing around," Genevieve hissed, her voice a harsh whisper echoing in the confined space. I am not going to let your bruised ego ruin the most important night of my career. We are going to handle this right now, Julian. Like adults. Julian looked down at her. The emerald gown, the symbol of her infidelity, practically glowed in the muted light. Like adults, he repeated softly, testing the weight of the phrase. Is that what we are calling it, Jen? Do not play games, she snapped, her hazel eyes flashing with defensive anger. The terms are more than fair. You keep the house in the suburbs. I get the city apartment and my shares in the new firm. I am trying to protect both of our dignities here. If you drag this out through the courts, it will get ugly, and you know you do not have the stomach for a public fight. It was a masterful manipulation, framing her ruthless discard of their 8-year marriage as an act of mercy. Julian stared at her, watching the rapid pulse jumping at the base of her throat. She was terrified he would say no. She was terrified he would tear the envelope in half and walk back into the light of the chandeliers to announce her sins to the partners she so desperately wanted to impress. He faced a distinct choice in the shadowed alcove. He could refuse. He could throw the papers at her feet, hire a shark of a lawyer tomorrow, and drag her name through the mud for the next 2 years. It would be a brutal, agonizing war of attrition. But Julian did not want a war. He wanted an execution. If he fought her now, she would keep her guard up. She and Alexander would brace for impact, protecting the fragile financial foundations of Bennett and Hayes. But if he surrendered completely, if he gave her exactly what she wanted with zero resistance, she would become dangerously careless in her victory. Julian looked past her shoulder, noting the shadow of Alexander Ashford pacing nervously just beyond the velvet curtain. They thought they held all the cards. They had no idea that Julian had spent the last 6 months quietly restructuring the private architectural trust that secretly underwrote her new firm's primary lease. You want to protect our dignity, Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. He finally broke the seal of the envelope, pulling out the thick stack of legal documents. Fine, Genevieve. Let us protect it. The thick stack of papers felt almost vibrating in Julian's grip. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Genevieve held her breath, the tense rise and fall of her chest the only movement in the suffocating quiet of the alcove. The jazz band outside swelled to a triumphant crescendo, a stark, mocking soundtrack to the death of their 8 years together. The notary is in the private lounge, Genevieve repeated softly, the frantic edge leaving her voice as she saw his absolute stillness. She extended a manicured hand, palm up, offering him a sleek, silver corporate pen, the kind given out at shareholder meetings. It was a sterile, transactional object. Just sign the last page, Julian. I will handle the rest. Julian looked at the cheap pen resting on her palm. It was the easy way out. He could take it, scribble his name, and reduce the end of his marriage to the emotional equivalent of signing a grocery receipt. But as he stared at the cheap silver, a cold, calculating resolve settled over him. He wasn't just signing away a marriage. He was detonating a carefully laid trap. And for that, he needed the right tool. He slowly reached into the breast pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. His fingers closed around the cool, heavy brass of his vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, engraved with their initials, J and G. Genevieve had given it to him on the morning of their wedding, accompanied by a handwritten note about building a beautiful future together. Genevieve's eyes widened fractionally as he withdrew the pen. The silver one remained untouched in her outstretched hand. The color drained slightly from her face as she recognized the brass barrel gleaming under the dim alcove lights. The silence between them grew jagged, sharp enough to cut glass. Julian, she whispered, her voice faltering for the first time all evening. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't offer a dramatic speech or a bitter smile. He uncapped the Mont Blanc with a soft, decisive click. He flipped the thick legal document to the final page, bypassing the meticulously crafted clauses detailing the division of their assets and the surrender of his rights. He found the blank line hovering ominously above his printed name. The nib of the pen touched the heavy paper. The ink flowed smoothly, dark and indelible, as he signed his name with slow, deliberate precision. Every curve of the letters felt like a physical severing of the ties that bound him to the woman standing before him. He was signing away the house in the suburbs, the shared bank accounts, the quiet mornings over coffee. He was signing away the illusion of the life he thought they had built. He finished the signature with a sharp, final flourish. The deed was done. The silence in the alcove deepened, heavy with the weight of the irrevocable act. He recapped the pen with another soft click and slid it back into his pocket. He then picked up the stack of papers and extended them toward Genevieve. His face was a mask of terrifying serenity. He had given her exactly what she wanted. He had surrendered without a fight, ensuring her complete, devastating victory. Now, all he had to do was watch her kingdom fall. Genevieve snatched the heavy stack of documents from Julian's outstretched hand. The movement was sharp, almost frantic, as if she feared he might suddenly come to his senses and snatch them back. She pressed the manila envelope against the bodice of her emerald gown, a physical barrier between her past and her meticulously planned future. The tight, anxious lines around her mouth instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, breathless relief. She had won. She had excised the dead weight without a single raised voice or shattered glass. "The notary is just down the hall," she whispered, her tone already shifting from adversarial to dismissive. She was no longer looking at her husband of 8 years. She was looking at a completed checklist item. "I will have copies sent to your new address by Monday." Julian simply nodded, his face an impenetrable mask of calm. He turned and parted the heavy velvet curtains, stepping out of the shadowed alcove and back into the blinding, golden light of the launch party. He did not get far. Standing just a few feet away, practically vibrating with smug anticipation, was Alexander Ashford. Alexander held 2 fresh glasses of champagne. As Genevieve emerged behind Julian, clutching the envelope like a trophy, Alexander's chest puffed out under his tailored suit. He stepped forward, closing the physical distance between himself and Genevieve in a way that was undeniably possessive. He handed her a glass, his knuckles brushing intimately against hers, completely dropping the facade of professional distance. "Julian," Alexander said, his voice dripping with practiced, corporate sympathy. It was the tone of a man who believed he had just bested a weaker opponent. "Genevieve told me about the arrangement. I want to say I respect how you are handling this. Clean breaks are always best for business." Julian looked at the champagne glass in Alexander's hand, then up to the man's arrogant eyes. "Business," Julian echoed quietly. "Yes, that is what tonight is all about, isn't it?" "Exactly," Alexander smiled, taking a slow sip of his drink. He threw a knowing glance at Genevieve. "Bennett and Hayes requires absolute focus. And, frankly, unencumbered assets. The board at the Sterling building was incredibly strict about our financial independence before approving the lease for this penthouse. We needed a clean cap table. Your cooperation in signing away any claim to Genevieve's shares ensures the firm's stability." Genevieve stood taller, a triumphant gleam in her hazel eyes as she looked around the lavish, sprawling venue she believed she now entirely owned. Julian slid his hands into his trouser pockets, his thumbs grazing the cool brass of his Mont Blanc pen. He looked around the penthouse, taking in the panoramic views of Manhattan, the crystal chandeliers, and the sheer, breathtaking expense of the real estate. "It is a magnificent space," Julian murmured, his voice carrying clearly over the jazz band. 30,000 square feet of prime Manhattan real estate. The security deposit alone must have been astronomical for a firm with 0 active billing history. Alexander chuckled, a patronizing sound. "That is the magic of corporate structuring, Julian. Genevieve and I secured a private guarantor, a blind trust that underwrote the lease until our first quarter revenues stabilize. Completely ironclad. The St. James Architectural Trust," Julian stated flatly. The patronizing smile vanished from Alexander's face. Genevieve's champagne glass paused halfway to her lips. The air between the 3 of them suddenly turned freezing cold. "How do you know the name of the holding company?" Genevieve asked, her voice dropping to a cautious, brittle whisper. Julian finally allowed a small, tired smile to touch the corners of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. Because I established it, Genevieve. 10 years ago. Before I ever met you. It is the repository for my grandfather's commercial patents, entirely separate from our marital assets. He watched the color begin to drain from his wife's flawless face. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to absorb the gravity of their own ignorance. You were very thorough with the divorce petition, Julian continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. Section 4, paragraph 2. Complete and total severance of my financial liabilities regarding any of your current or future corporate entities. You drafted it to ensure I could never claim a dime of Bennett and Hayes. Alexander took a step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, as if the building itself were suddenly collapsing around him. You, Alexander choked out. You are the guarantor. I was, Julian corrected softly. Until about 3 minutes ago. By legally forcing me to sever all financial ties to your business, you just nullified the guarantor agreement for this lease. The documents you are holding against your chest, Genevieve, mandate my immediate withdrawal from all your corporate accounts. Genevieve looked down at the manila envelope as if it had suddenly turned into a live explosive. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. No, that cannot be right. The landlord is a personal friend of my family, Julian finished for her. He requires a fully backed guarantor for new firms. Without the trust, you are in breach of contract. By Monday morning, when those divorce papers are filed, Bennett and Hayes will be evicted from the Sterling building. And since you poured your entire liquid capital into the launch party, you do not have the cash to secure a new lease. Julian looked at the two brilliant, ruthless lawyers who had spent months plotting his demise, only to meticulously orchestrate their own ruin. They had been so blinded by their affair and their ambition that they never bothered to look beneath the surface of the money that funded their dreams. The realization hit Genevieve with the force of a physical blow. The emerald gown, the glittering chandeliers, the murmuring crowd of elites. It all suddenly felt like a garish, suffocating stage set poised to collapse. She clutched the manila envelope so tightly her knuckles turned white, her perfect manicure digging into the very papers that had sealed her doom. Alexander Ashford stood frozen, his face a mask of dawning horror. The arrogant, predatory posture he had held mere minutes ago had vanished, replaced by the panicked stillness of a man realizing he had just steered a multi-million-dollar ship directly into an iceberg. The champagne in his glass trembled slightly. Julian, Genevieve breathed, the word a desperate, fractured sound. It was the first time all evening she truly looked at him, not as an obstacle or a discarded piece of her past, but as the architect of her destruction. You cannot do this. You cannot just pull the funding out from under us. We have clients coming on Monday. We have staff. I did not pull anything, Genevieve, Julian replied, his voice maintaining its terrifying, even cadence. The jazz band played a lively, upbeat tune in the background, entirely ignorant of the catastrophe unfolding near the coat check. You did. You brought me the petition. You demanded I sign away my connection to your business. I simply followed your instructions to the letter. He looked at Alexander, whose face was rapidly cycling through shock, rage, and profound calculation as he realized the professional suicide he had just committed by partnering with Genevieve. You both wanted a clean break for business, Julian noted, his eyes locked on Alexander's pale face. You got it. The St. James Trust is officially unencumbered. Good luck explaining the eviction notice to your new partners. Genevieve reached out, her hand trembling violently as she tried to grasp Julian's sleeve. Please, she whispered, her voice cracking. The polished, ruthless lawyer was gone, replaced by a woman staring into the abyss of her own making. We can tear them up. We can draft a new agreement. I didn't know. Julian looked down at her hand, hovering inches from his arm, and then back up to her wide, terrified hazel eyes. He thought of the email. He thought of the 6 months of agonizing silence, watching her lie, watching her build a future on the foundation of his silent support while planning to discard him. You didn't know, Julian repeated softly, shaking his head. Because you never bothered to ask. General, you were so busy looking at the penthouse view. You never looked at the foundation. He didn't yell. He didn't gloat. The profound emptiness in his chest had finally settled into a cold, unbreakable peace. He reached down to his left hand. Slowly, deliberately, he twisted the simple gold band off his ring finger. It slid off easily, the metal cold against his skin. Genevieve's breath hitched as she watched the movement, her eyes fixed on the ring. It was the final, undeniable severance. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't throw it. He turned toward the sleek, black marble bar top beside them. He placed the heavy manila envelope, the signed copy he had retained for himself, down on the polished surface. Then, with absolute finality, he set the gold wedding band precisely in the center of the documents. The soft clink of the metal against the marble sounded like a judge's gavel dropping in an empty courtroom. He buttoned his suit jacket, his movements smooth and practiced. He looked at the two of them one last time. The brilliant lawyers who had outsmarted everyone, including themselves. The glittering empire of Bennett and Hayes was already dead. They just hadn't felt the rigor mortis set in yet. Julian turned his back on the alcove, the emerald gown, and the 8 years of quiet sacrifice. He began to walk toward the exit, the heavy oak doors of the Sterling Building penthouse looming ahead. Julian. Genevieve's voice echoed behind him, a frantic, shattered plea over the rising swell of the jazz music. Julian, please. He did not break his stride. He pushed open the heavy doors, stepping out into the cool, quiet hallway, leaving the intoxicating hum of the launch party behind. As the doors swung shut, cutting off the music in her desperate voice, he spoke to the empty corridor, the words of final, solitary verdict on the ashes of his marriage. You got exactly what you wanted, Genevieve, but you forgot to calculate the cost.